Good evening. I'm Alex Truth.
And I'm Maya Clarity. Welcome to Truth Report. Tonight, we're investigating a disturbing pattern emerging across multiple war zones and political theaters, a pattern where governments are weaponizing legal systems, police power, and reconstruction plans not to protect people, but to silence dissent and erase entire populations.
We've spent the last 72 hours digging through newly unsealed legal documents, congressional voting records, and reconstruction blueprints. What we found connects dots that span from college campuses in America to the bombed-out streets of Gaza, from Miami Beach police stations to the halls of Congress.
These aren't isolated incidents. They're symptoms of a much deeper disease in how power operates when challenged, especially when that challenge involves speaking truth about war.
Let's start with a story that just broke this morning. According to documents unsealed January 23 after litigation by The Intercept, Secretary of State Marco Rubio targeted 5 students and academics for deportation: Mahmoud Khalil, Yunseo Chung, Rumeysa Ozturk, Badar Khan Suri, and Mohsen Madawi. Rubio publicly claimed these were Hamas supporters who posed national security threats.
But here's what the government's own internal memos reveal, Alex. A Department of Homeland Security document dated March 8, 2025, explicitly states DHS has not identified any alternative grounds of removability, including the ground of removability for aliens who have provided material support to a foreign terrorist organization. Let me repeat that: the government found zero evidence of material support to terrorism.
Zero evidence. Yet just one day later, on March 9, Rubio went on social media calling them Hamas supporters. This wasn't a mistake or an intelligence failure. This was a deliberate lie told by America's chief diplomat to justify deporting students for exercising their First Amendment rights.
And what were those rights? Writing op-eds, attending protests, criticizing Israeli government policy toward Palestinians. State Department memos show officials knew courts would closely scrutinize deportation determinations based on protected speech. They knew this was legally shaky ground, but they proceeded anyway.
The students won their lawsuit in January 2026. These documents only came to light because The Intercept and other outlets fought for their release. Which raises the question, how many other cases like this exist where the records remain sealed?
This is the chilling effect in action, Alex. When the Secretary of State can publicly brand students as terrorists without evidence, when deportation proceedings can be initiated based solely on political speech, every international student watching this has to wonder, am I next? Can I afford to speak up?
And that's exactly the point. This isn't about national security, it's about controlling the narrative around war. Rubio didn't target these students because they posed a threat to America. He targeted them because they posed a threat to unconditional support for Israeli military operations.
Which brings us to our second story, because the suppression of dissent doesn't stop at targeting students. It extends to using police power to intimidate ordinary citizens. On January 7, a Miami Beach resident named Raquel Pacheco posted criticism on Facebook about Mayor Stephen Minor. She wrote that the mayor consistently calls for the death of all Palestinians while claiming Miami Beach welcomes everyone.
5 days later, 2 plainclothes detectives showed up at her door. They had screenshots of her post on their phones. One officer told her, according to reporting from The Intercept, that can probably incite someone to do something radical. They suggested she refrain from posting things like that.
Let's be crystal clear about what happened here. A citizen criticized an elected official on social media. That official's police department then sent armed officers to her home to intimidate her into silence. This is textbook First Amendment violation, and it's not even a close call.
Daniel Tilley from the ACLU of Florida told The Intercept, this Facebook post was protected speech, and it's not a close question, not remotely. He warned this government action would chill legitimate criticism. And that's the goal, Maya. When police can show up at your door for a Facebook post, how many other people will think twice before criticizing their mayor?
And notice the pattern: both Rubio's deportation threats and the Miami Beach police visit involve criticism of Israeli government policy. Mayor Minor, who is a vocal Israel advocate, previously tried to evict an independent cinema for screening the documentary No Other Land, calling it hateful propaganda.
Police Chief Wayne Jones justified the visit to Pacheco's home by citing concerns about inflammatory, potentially insightful false remarks. But here's the problem with that logic: the government doesn't get to decide which political criticism is inflammatory or false and then send police to silence it. That's authoritarianism 101.
Pacheco later clarified that Minor may not have used those exact words, but her post represented her interpretation of his blind support for Israel. That's called political commentary. That's called holding elected officials accountable. And it's supposed to be protected in a democracy.
But we're seeing that protection erode in real time. And it's not just happening at the local or executive level, it's happening in Congress. On January 22, the House of Representatives voted on a resolution to block further military attacks on Venezuela. The vote ended 215 to 215, which under House rules means the resolution failed.
Here's where it gets interesting. Republican Representative Wesley Hunt from Texas was absent during the vote. He was out campaigning for a U.S. Senate seat. Speaker Mike Johnson held the vote open for over 20 minutes, waiting for Hunt to arrive and cast the deciding vote against blocking the war.
Representative Pat Ryan, a Democrat from New York, was caught on record shouting, "Close the vote. Come on. Seriously. This is serious shit." But Johnson ignored him. He kept that poll open until Hunt showed up to provide the 215th vote needed to kill the resolution.
Think about what this means procedurally. Every Democrat voted to block military action against Venezuela. Only 2 Republicans broke ranks, Thomas Massie from Kentucky and Don Bacon from Nebraska. But because Johnson was willing to bend the rules and hold the vote open indefinitely, he ensured the measure failed.
This wasn't about following proper procedure. This was about making sure the Trump administration maintains a free hand for military operations in Venezuela. 2 weeks earlier, a similar Senate War Powers resolution had also failed. The pattern is clear: Congress is refusing to exercise its constitutional authority to restrain executive war-making.
And let's talk about Venezuela for a moment, because the American public has been given almost zero context for why military action might be under consideration. What vital U.S. interest is at stake that justifies potential military intervention? What's the legal basis? What's the strategic objective?
These questions aren't being asked in mainstream coverage, and that's by design. When Congress votes to authorize, or in this case, fails to block, military action, the debate should be front-page news. Instead, it's buried. Most Americans probably don't even know this vote happened.
Which is exactly how the war machine prefers it. Quiet votes, arcane procedures, minimal public scrutiny. By the time military operations escalate, the public is presented with a fait accompli: troops are already deployed, commitments are already made, and questioning the war becomes not supporting our soldiers.
Now let's turn to Gaza, because what's happening there represents the logical endpoint of unchecked war-making combined with massive economic interests. The Wall Street Journal first reported on something called Project Sunrise, a 10-year, $55 billion plan to rebuild Gaza as a smart city with AI-optimized electrical grids, high-speed rail, and luxury beachfront developments.
According to reporting from the Intercept, the plan calls for transforming Rafah from a pre-war population of 171,000 to over 500,000 residents. Schools would increase from 80 to more than 200. Hospitals from 3 to 75. It sounds like a humanitarian reconstruction effort, until you read the fine print.
The plan is being led by Trump administration special envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. The Board of Peace includes Tony Blair, Marco Rubio, yes, the same Marco Rubio who lied about students being Hamas supporters, Apollo Global Management CEO Mark Rowan, and World Bank President Ajay Bunga. Backing comes from the UAE, Morocco, Vietnam, and Canada.
Here's the catch that renders this entire plan an instrument of ethnic cleansing. According to the Intercept's reporting, reconstruction is contingent on comprehensive compliance by Hamas to demilitarize. In other words, the rebuilding of Palestinian homes depends on political concessions that effectively strip Gaza of any defensive capability.
But it gets worse, Maya. Much worse. The Intercept reports that Rafah was deliberately raised last year as a form of collective punishment. The planned seafront Riviera would encroach on refugee camps Al-Shadi and Nuseirat. Eastern Gaza areas designated for industrial development would eliminate towns like Kuzayeh and Burich. Jabalia's core appears slated to become a rectangular park.
Let me translate that from urban planning language into plain English. They're erasing Palestinian towns and replacing them with parks and luxury developments. This isn't reconstruction, it's colonial real estate development masquerading as humanitarian aid.
And the evidence of ongoing ethnic cleansing is documented. The Intercept reports that areas under IDF control currently contain virtually no Palestinians, only IDF-affiliated militiamen and collaborators receive housing and services. The Popular Forces militia operates from destroyed structures, with documented instances of torture and sexual assault.
Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz stated publicly, "We are deep inside Gaza and we will never leave Gaza." That's not the language of temporary security operations. That's the language of permanent occupation. And Project Sunrise provides the economic blueprint for making that occupation profitable for well-connected investors.
Think about who benefits from this $55 billion plan. Apollo Global Management, one of the world's largest private equity firms. Construction companies. Technology firms providing AI infrastructure. Real estate developers building beachfront properties. These are the same financial interests that profit from reconstruction after every war, and therefore have a perverse incentive for wars to happen.
This is disaster capitalism at its most naked and brutal. First, you destroy the existing infrastructure through military operations framed as security necessities. Then you displace the population. Then you rebuild in a way that excludes the original inhabitants while enriching corporate investors. It's a playbook that's been used from post-Katrina New Orleans to post-invasion Iraq.
And notice how the language shifts. It's never called ethnic cleansing or forcible displacement, it's reconstruction and modernization and smart city development. The violence gets laundered through technical terminology and humanitarian rhetoric.
The Intercept's reporting notes that despite ceasefire provisions requiring humanitarian aid and Israeli withdrawals, Phase 2 commenced without these conditions being met. Netanyahu publicly backs the ceasefire while his defense minister declares permanent occupation. The contradiction isn't a bug, it's a feature. The ceasefire provides international legitimacy while occupation continues on the ground.
Now let's connect this back to Rubio targeting students and Miami Beach police intimidating Facebook posts. Why does criticism of Israeli government policy trigger such extreme responses from U.S. officials? Because the entire structure we've just described, the military operations, the reconstruction contracts, the strategic alliance, depends on maintaining unconditional American support.
When students write op-eds questioning that support, when citizens post criticism on Facebook, they're not just expressing opinions. They're threatening a multi-billion-dollar apparatus that spans defense contractors, private equity firms, diplomatic relationships, and political careers.
That's why Rubio was willing to lie and call them Hamas supporters. That's why Miami Beach police felt empowered to show up at someone's door. That's why Speaker Johnson held a vote open to kill a Venezuela resolution. The system protects itself, and truth becomes the enemy.
Let's look at our final story tonight, because while all of this is happening in Gaza and in U.S. political institutions, there's an actual war with a clear aggressor that receives far less attention. Bellingcat's reporting on Russia's invasion of Ukraine shows the devastating impact on Ukrainian youth.
On November 17, 2 explosions struck the town of Bellingcat during the night. 3 people were killed, 13 injured, with 4 children among the wounded. A kindergarten located about 100 meters from the impact site sustained damage. This is one incident among thousands.
According to Bellingcat's investigation, 3,676 educational facilities have been damaged across Ukraine. 394 have been completely destroyed. Over 200 schools are documented in Bellingcat's dataset alone. Kharkiv Oblast experienced the heaviest impact, with at least 26 schools, kindergartens, colleges, or universities directly damaged.
Nearly 1 million Ukrainian children have been forced into online-only learning. Many schools remain closed or disrupted by constant air raid alarms. Parents are terrified to send their children to school because schools keep getting bombed. Academic performance has declined across reading, mathematics, and science.
Mental health professionals report widespread fear and anxiety among children. Adolescents are suffering from self-harm, suicidal thoughts, and processing the loss of loved ones. Bellingcat interviewed a 15-year-old from Bellingcat who studies at home, rarely leaves his house, and is dealing with his father's death.
Ukraine has implemented over 300 resilience centers to support children's mental health, with 300 more planned. Underground schools in Kharkiv allow rotating half-day attendance for 1,400 students weekly. Over 130,000 health professionals have received mental health training through WHO programs.
This is what actual warfare looks like when you strip away the euphemisms. Children studying in underground bunkers. Teenagers self-harming. Educational facilities systematically destroyed. Entire generations traumatized. This is the reality that gets lost when we treat war as a geopolitical chess game.
And here's the bitter irony. The U.S. Congress can't pass a resolution to block potential military action in Venezuela, but it also can't seem to maintain consistent support for Ukraine's defense against an obvious war of aggression. The coverage of Project Sunrise in Gaza dwarfs coverage of Ukrainian children studying underground.
The selectivity reveals priorities. Some wars matter more than others. Some civilian casualties generate outrage while others are treated as unfortunate necessities. Some reconstruction plans are framed as generous humanitarian efforts while others are recognized as what they are, rebuilding destroyed nations at profit.
And when people try to point out these contradictions, when students write op-eds, when citizens post on Facebook, when journalists investigate, they face deportation, police intimidation, career destruction, and systematic silencing.
So let's synthesize what we've uncovered tonight. We have a Secretary of State who fabricated terrorism allegations to deport students for protected speech. We have local police acting as enforcers against criticism of Israel policy. We have Congress manipulating procedures to avoid restricting executive war powers. We have a $55 billion reconstruction plan that amounts to colonial displacement. And we have millions of Ukrainian children whose suffering barely penetrates the news cycle.
These aren't separate stories. They're facets of the same system, a system where war is profitable, where dissent is criminalized, where reconstruction means dispossession, and where the violence required to maintain all of this gets redirected against anyone who speaks up.
The Rubio case is particularly instructive because the documents prove the lie. The government's own memos admit there's no evidence of material support to terrorism. That didn't stop the Secretary of State from publicly branding students as Hamas supporters. Which means the accusation itself was the point, not because it was true, but because it would silence others.
When the cost of speaking up includes potential deportation, police visits, professional destruction, and public smearing as a terrorist supporter, most people will choose silence. That's not security policy, that's authoritarian control of public discourse.
And look at who's driving Project Sunrise. Jared Kushner, who tried and failed to bring peace to the Middle East during the first Trump administration, now gets another chance, but this time with $55 billion in reconstruction contracts on the table. Tony Blair, whose Iraq war legacy includes hundreds of thousands of dead civilians, now sits on the board of peace.
Mark Rowan from Apollo Global Management, overseeing investments in a plan that requires the permanent displacement of Palestinians from their homes. These aren't humanitarian actors, they're profiteers with a track record of benefiting from war and instability.
The smart city language is particularly insidious. AI-optimized electrical grids, high-speed rail, luxury beachfront, it all sounds so modern and progressive. But smart city technology in the context of occupation means surveillance infrastructure. It means control systems. It means building a Gaza that serves Israeli strategic interests and corporate profits, not Palestinian self-determination.
And the conditional nature of the reconstruction, requiring Hamas to demilitarize first, ensures that Palestinians have no leverage. Either accept permanent vulnerability and foreign control, or watch as your destroyed homes stay destroyed. That's not a choice, it's coercion through destruction.
Meanwhile, the IDF continues moving demarcation lines further and further inward, shrinking Gaza even beyond the official plans. Israeli officials declare they'll never leave. The ceasefire becomes cover for consolidating territorial gains rather than a path toward actual peace.
Back to the Venezuela vote, we still don't have answers about what military action is being contemplated or why. The resolution failed on a tie vote only because Speaker Johnson held the poll open for over 20 minutes waiting for a Republican who was out campaigning. That's not how democratic deliberation about war is supposed to work.
It reveals how little regard the current leadership has for constitutional war powers. The founders gave Congress the authority to declare war specifically to prevent executives from unilaterally launching military operations. But when Congress won't exercise that authority, or worse, when it manipulates procedures to avoid restricting the executive, that check on power becomes meaningless.
And the Ukrainian children studying underground, processing trauma, losing years of education, they represent what all of this looks like when the bombs actually fall. The geopolitical maneuvering, the reconstruction contracts, the suppression of dissent, it all culminates in real human beings, many of them children, living in terror.
Bellingcat's reporting shows that mental health professionals are diagnosing widespread fear, anxiety, self-harm, and suicidal ideation among Ukrainian adolescents. These aren't abstract casualties of war, these are specific, documented psychological injuries that will shape an entire generation.
3,676 educational facilities damaged. 394 completely destroyed. Those numbers represent not just buildings but futures, the future doctors, engineers, teachers, artists who should be learning in safe environments but instead are studying in bunkers or not at all.
And Russia's systematic targeting of educational infrastructure isn't accidental. Destroying schools serves multiple purposes, it terrorizes civilian populations, it disrupts social cohesion, it signals that nowhere is safe. It's a war crime, and it's happening in plain sight.
So where does this leave us? We have documented proof that the U.S. Secretary of State lied about students to justify deportation based on political speech. We have police departments sending officers to intimidate citizens over Facebook posts criticizing elected officials. We have Congress manipulating votes to avoid restraining executive war powers. We have a reconstruction plan for Gaza that amounts to corporate-backed ethnic cleansing. And we have Ukrainian children living underground while their schools are systematically destroyed.
The pattern is clear, power protects itself through violence, both physical and legal. When that violence is challenged through speech, journalism, or protest, the system deploys everything from deportation threats to police intimidation to media blackouts.
The unsealed documents in the Rubio case only came to light because the Intercept and other outlets fought for their release. How much more remains hidden? How many other students have been threatened? How many other citizens have received police visits that were never reported?
And how many people saw what happened to Mahmoud Khalil and the other students, saw the Secretary of State call them Hamas supporters on social media, saw deportation proceedings initiated, and decided it wasn't worth speaking up? That's the incalculable damage of these intimidation campaigns.
For people watching this who want to take action, first, understand that your speech is protected. Writing op-eds, attending protests, criticizing government policy, posting on social media, these are constitutional rights. Organizations like the ACLU exist specifically to defend those rights when government actors violate them.
Second, pay attention to what your representatives are doing. The Venezuela vote happened with minimal coverage. Most people don't know it occurred. But your congressman voted either to block or to enable potential military action. That's information you can use when deciding whether to vote for them again.
Third, follow journalists and organizations doing this investigative work. The Intercept, Bellingcat, and others are filing lawsuits to unseal documents, tracking war crimes, and exposing contradictions between official rhetoric and reality. Support that journalism financially if you can, it's expensive and legally risky work.
Fourth, make the connections we've made tonight. When you hear about reconstruction plans, ask who profits. When you hear about national security threats, ask to see the evidence. When you hear about smart cities in occupied territories, ask what happened to the people who lived there before.
The stories we've covered tonight span continents and contexts, but they're unified by a simple dynamic: those with power will use that power to silence challenges and profit from destruction. They're counting on you not to notice the patterns, not to connect the dots, not to ask uncomfortable questions.
But now you've seen the documents. You've seen Rubio's lie exposed by the government's own memos. You've seen police showing up at doors over Facebook posts. You've seen Congress holding votes open to manipulate outcomes. You've seen luxury developments planned where refugee camps currently stand. You've seen Ukrainian children learning underground.
You can't unsee it. And once you see the pattern, you see it everywhere, in how wars are started, how dissent is suppressed, how reconstruction enriches the connected, how violence gets deployed against truth-tellers.
This is Truth Report. We're Alex Truth and Maya Clarity. The documents don't lie, even when the officials do. Keep asking questions. Keep demanding evidence. Keep speaking up.
And remember, when they come after students for writing op-eds, when they send police to your door for Facebook posts, when they manipulate votes and hide evidence and build smart cities on the ruins of razed towns, they're not doing it because they're strong. They're doing it because they're afraid of what happens when people learn the truth.
The truth is this: their power depends on your silence. Break it.
Good night.